Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Payment Acceptance, Driving Change Through Collaboration. Hi, I'm Judy Howard with ARC, and I'm excited to introduce two of my colleagues as our presenters today. We have with us, need to change my screen. We have Jennifer Watkins, Director of Payments, and Kevin Haig, Manager, Payment and Processing Acceptance. And before I turn it over to Jennifer, I just want to go over a few housekeeping so we can have a nice interactive session today. In your control panel, if you do want to ask questions, Jennifer and Kevin will be taking those throughout the presentation. Just type those in. They'll answer them as they go along. Also, at the end, we'll answer any questions that haven't been presented to them. And also, this webinar will be recorded today. It will be posted on our arccorp.com website in the next couple of days, so you can look there. On-demand webinars would be the section you'd be looking for. So without further ado, Jennifer, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Judy. Thanks for the introduction. I guess I'll start, if you want to go to the next slide, Judy. Start just by talking a little bit about what we're going to talk about today, starting with the agenda. So the focus of this webinar was to sort of summarize what happened at the ARC Payments Forum. So I'll give you a little bit of overview and talk about what happened. We'll go through the ARC landscape, what's happening at ARC transaction-wise, payment-wise. Kevin will talk about data quality that's tied to interchange qualification, credit card company rules and compliance, and chargeback reduction. I'll also talk about 3D Secure. I'll do an overview of chargebacks and a little bit about what ARC's initiatives are we're working on right now, and then a look ahead into what we think payments might look like in the future. Next slide, Judy. So the ARC Payments Forum, this year was our 8th year. The last 2 years in 2020 and 2021 were virtual, but we did an in-person session this year at Lansdowne, which is very close to Dulles Airport in Virginia. And very excited for everyone to get together. It was fantastic. We had over 100 participants, which was bigger than we've ever had before. I think people were really enthusiastic to get out and get together again. So it was, I think Kevin and I would both consider a very successful in-person ARC Payments Forum this year. So just to give you a little bit of background, the goals of the ARC Payments Forum is to bring all the participants in the transaction flow together to make sure that we're supporting payments in a way that provides the best customer service, that improves risk management and prevents loss, and then ensures the lowest cost processing of payment. So there's a lot in there. And basically, this session is going to be talking about how we do all of those things. But the key, as is in the title of this webinar, is collaboration and how we as an industry work together to collaborate to meet those needs. So Judy, next slide. So what happened this year at the Payments Forum? So we had presentations from all the major card brands, American Express, Discover, MasterCard, and Visa. They all talked about what's going on in their world, how it impacts ARC, how it impacts the industry, how it impacts airlines for direct sales. This covers everything from, chargeback management to rules changes that are coming up, partnerships that they have in place, what rules changes we can expect in the next couple of years. And it gets down to sort of the data element level. So for transactions or payments to work in our ecosystem, agents, GDSs, ARC, airline acquirers, when it comes to a Visa or MasterCard transaction, Visa and MasterCard card issuers, everyone in that transaction flow needs to be doing their part in order to ensure transactions process successfully. And so those presentations from the card brands are really around how highlighting how each person or each entity in that transaction flow has part to play in the successful processing of transactions. So that was really the whole first day, was just basically those 4 card brands talking. And actually it went into a little bit into the next day as well. We did a payments panel that was moderated by UATP and included WorldPay, CellPoint Digital, who supports sort of those non-traditional or alternative forms of payment. Amadeus, who has a big payments team that's supported various payment initiatives around the world. And then Sitcon, who is really focused on supporting alternative payments as well. WeChat Pay has been one of their main sort of focuses in how to bring WeChat Pay to the US. BitPay, they are really starting to grow in the travel space. They're a company that supports cryptocurrency. They allow merchants to accept cryptocurrency without having to actually touch the cryptocurrency. They manage sort of the risk that goes along with the volatility of cryptocurrency, but they make it simple for customers to pay using, whether it's Ethereum or Bitcoin or sort of, I think they support something like the top 15 cryptocurrencies. Riskified did a presentation. They are a fraud prevention provider. They also provide chargeback management services. They did a presentation. We did a fraud panel that included American Airlines, Air Canada, A4A, formerly Airlines for America, and ARC. We talked about a specific type of fraud that airlines and agents are experiencing, which is a situation where agents or airlines are being spoofed by online sort of bad actors. So these are basically fraudulent travel agents who are acting like an airline or like an agency. So we spent that panel talking about that. IATA did an update on what's happening in their world around payments. And then the last day, we did a fraud prevention and chargeback working group session. Basically, it was a much smaller group. We talked about sort of what the pain points are around fraud prevention, how we as agents and airlines, acquirers, GDSs can all work together to help reduce fraud and improve the chargeback management process. So that's basically what happened. We're going to get into some of the key themes that came out of it, and these will be woven throughout Kevin and I's presentation today. But highlights, there's a need to improve data. The card brands have requirements around data that require things that are beyond like an approval code. So for an airline, approval code's the key thing, but there's also data that comes behind that transaction beyond an approval code that's required to support 3D Secure, support tokenization, to qualify transactions for the best rates, to reduce chargebacks. So there's a big theme around payments, and Kevin's going to get into a lot more detail about that. Credit card authorizations are required, and they've always been required, but the card brands are really started to clamp down now and say, hey, if there is not a valid authorization done on a transaction at the time of ticketing through the GDS, there's a risk that that transaction is not going to settle successfully or come back as a chargeback. It's definitely going to cost more to process that transaction. And so there's a lot of focus on just ensuring that authorizations are done properly. Again, we talked about changes that are going to be coming that impact the agency. Card brands are doing changes. Fraud, obviously you can't really talk about payments without talking about fraud. We're not going to spend a lot of time today talking about fraud because Fraud Month is coming up. Actually, the month of September is Fraud Month, and the fraud team at ARC's got several webinars set up, including one from Riskified, to talk about fraud. But we will talk a little bit about disputes and chargebacks because Kevin and I lead the team at ARC that manage those two things. Next slide, Judy. So the ARC landscape, next slide. So I'm just going to give you a real high level overview of what's happening at ARC right now. We have 236 airlines. We still have over 10,000 travel agents. We've seen obviously consolidation over the years, but still, even during the pandemic, we did not see just an enormous consolidation of agents. It's sort of just been continuing over the last probably 10, 15 years. In 2021, we processed $38.9 billion in transactions. That is clearly down from $97 billion that we processed in 2019. It is up from what it was in 2020. About 90% of those transactions are credit card and 10% of those are cash. Next slide, Judy. So this is showing sort of the recovery and where the volumes are coming from. The black line is the actual for ARC. So these are the transaction volumes settled through ARC. You can see the green line, which is leisure, is growing fastest and is actually exceeding all of the other demographic agencies. OTAs took off more quickly than everyone else, but they've sort of flattened out and are actually kind of underperforming other demographic groups within the travel agency distribution channel. And clearly corporate is still under where we would like to have it be. You know, there's talk about whether or not corporate will ever come back the way it was pre-pandemic. We've all become very accustomed to doing meetings on WebEx. We'll see if that changes. We're hopeful. Next slide, Judy. Domestic versus international. The black line again is the actual processing of transactions. You can see it's down about 10% right now, and domestic and international are both still down about 10%. We are hopeful and actually are seeing that post the lift of restrictions for international travel, that international travel will take off more quickly. Let's go to the next slide, Judy. And so this is our estimate. We are estimating that it's probably going to take us to 2024 to see a steady point where we've reached our 2019 numbers. So the recovery is happening, and it continues to happen. It's not going to be till 2024. We estimate that, or mid 2024, that we'll be back to where we were in 2019. Next slide, Judy. I am going to hand it over to Kevin to talk to us about some specific payment trends.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. Appreciate that. Next slide, Judy. So the next couple of slides, we're just going to talk a little bit about some of the things that we monitor at a high level here at ARC. Starting out with sales. So as Jennifer mentioned earlier, last 2019 we did $97.4 billion, and you can see 2017 through 2019 we're seeing a nice growth trend, increases every year. And then of course we all know what happened in 2020 with the pandemic. Sales dropped, travel almost came to a standstill. But then, as Jennifer mentioned earlier, we are starting to see a little bit of recovery in 2021, led mostly by leisure. And then now moving into 2022, about halfway through the year, a little less than halfway through the year, we still are seeing good travel on the leisure side and a little pickup in corporate, although not to the point we'd like to. And I think the good news here is that at this point, 2022, we're already surpassed 2021 sales. So by the end of the year, hopefully we'll be above the 2021 number and continue to follow that growth pattern and activity that Jennifer talked to earlier. Next slide, Judy. We also look at cash versus credit card. In the US, we're heavily credit card. We've been monitoring this particular trend for about the last 10, 11 years, and we're consistently around the 90%, 10% mark. So in which we're seeing still, as we're coming out of the pandemic now. If you stop and think, I mean, 2019, we did 97 billion. We did about 10 billion in cash. That's a huge number for ARC to handle. And so understanding what our breakdown between cash and credit gives us a better understanding of what that cash responsibility is and what the risk is out there. Next slide, Jennifer, or Judy. Now looking at by card brand, this is again one of those items that we continue to monitor, want to better understand our portfolio by dollar percentage. And I think the interesting point on this particular slide is if you look in the center, you have the American Express and MasterCard percents by dollar. We've been watching this sort of narrowing of the gap between those two brands for quite some time. And finally in 2021, we see where just for that brief moment, MasterCard has surpassed American Express. And I think that's partly due to heavy corporate and heavy high spend on the Amex side. And of course, with corporate travel non-existent and international travel, higher spend ticket non-existent to the extent, the extent of international travel, MasterCard then creeped up. But as you can see, as we're rolling into 2022, Amex is coming back, and we'll just see how far that gap widens by the end of the year. Next slide, Judy. And then also, as we look at by card brand, again, the interesting point is that middle of the slide. If we could roll this back to 2017, 2018, you'd start to see that gap narrow with American Express and MasterCard as well. And then, of course, at 2021, that bottoming out. But as corporate travel is coming back a little bit, and leisure and international, you have the American Express higher spend, higher demographic customer, doing some more traveling. So that gap is starting to narrow, and we'll see where we end up in 2022. Next slide, Judy. And then average ticket is another one we want to measure and watch. So, and of course, if you look at it, and if you sort of look at the last two slides, you can see where average ticket for American Express, is up there. And then UATP, that's the TP, the green line. So that's more of a corporate airline travel. So again, corporate usually has the higher average ticket. So you'd sort of expect to see the American Express and UATP up there as far as average ticket goes. And then when you look at Visa and MasterCard and Discover, of course, those are a little bit more leisure, so a lower average ticket. Next slide, Judy. So now I want to talk a little bit about data integrity. And as Jennifer mentioned, we're starting to see more interest from the brands and the issuers about the data and how it's presented and the impact when that data is missing. So if you can go to the next slide, Judy. So why is data integrity important? I think Jennifer touched on a little bit about the importance of data in the transaction. So there's really three areas that data plays a key role in. So it's the interchange and compliance fee area. And just a step back from an interchange perspective, for those hopefully, it's not an unfamiliar term, but interchange is really the fees that the merchant, or in this case, the airline, pays to accept credit cards. And based on the data, if there's a wealth of data available, then the interchange on those transactions is lower. If that data is missing, the interchange fee is higher. So that's why we really go out there and monitor and try to do what we can to improve the quality of that data that's being passed in interchange to help those airlines manage that expense. And the compliance fee part of it really ties to missing data. When that data is missing, there's additional compliance fees. So for instance, if you have a transaction, as Jennifer talked about earlier, maybe with an approval, but really doesn't have that auth data, you're going to get higher interchange on that transaction. You're probably going to see a misuse or an authorization related fee, and then you're going to see missing data on the compliance fee side. So one transaction can have three different fees associated with it, really driving the cost of acceptance for airlines. And so that's really, again, why we try to focus on keeping the data down or keeping the data available as we pass it through in our transactions. Data also has a big impact on chargebacks. So for instance, if that authorization data isn't there and some of the subsequent data elements that I'll show you in a minute aren't there, that leads to chargebacks. And some issues out there are being a little bit, I guess, more aggressive or watching their portfolio from a risk perspective as they're coming out of the pandemic, and really paying attention to when that data is missing and the ability to charge those transactions back. So with just those two, the interchange and compliance fees and chargeback, by having that data there, we're lessening the impact of both of those. The third items, there's probably less of an impact. I remember Jennifer usually talks about when the whole payments form first started and what was driving it, and it was down to one of the brands that made a change in data and transactions couldn't settle. And so that's a big thing. If airlines don't get paid, that's a big issue. Unfortunately, we haven't had those issues. We've addressed them. So settlement really isn't an issue today as it was early in 2015. But we're still out there watching, making sure that data gets passed. So we don't have those settlement issues, and we're making sure that the money's flowing where it needs to go and the airlines are getting paid. So next slide, please, Judy. So So here's some of those data elements. So down below, we've identified by card brand some of the key data elements that we're monitoring. And this effort really started back in 2015. Back then, there were some data elements that were missing as much as 75% of the time. And so ARC really looked upon themselves as being one of those players in the payment chain that could have an impact. So we started working with the GDSs or the global distribution systems to see what we could do to try to drive down the gap or the missing data and to really help get the benefit to all parties involved in the payment chain. And as you can see through mid-17 or 2017, we were driving down some of those data elements and getting it to the point where we were seeing it quite a bit of an improvement. Our goal as part of this process at a high level was, about 3%. If we can get the data missing 3% or less, given where we started, we thought that would be a success. And by mid 2018, you can see for the most part, we made that level, we met that goal. We're down around 3% or less on a lot of the data transactions or the data elements we were monitoring. So next slide, Judy. So if we fast forward to starting of 2020, just at the start of pandemic, for the most part, we were still down around the 3% level. You can see, a spike in the visa authorization response code. And again, this is some of the value we provide. We identified a gap. We reached out to the GDS that was impacting the data, and they ended up getting a fix in place and getting that corrected. It took a little time, but they ended up getting that there, and the data now then is down around that 3% level. And then also in 2020, we started to at least put on a graph additional data elements for Discover that we were monitoring, and then an additional element for MasterCard, which is a tick transaction or the transaction integrity class. And what that tick does is really another security type indicator for the transaction on how well the card and cardholder data match. So hopefully as we progress in our 2022 efforts, we will continue to drive down the tick and the Discover items. And then even our standard elements that we were looking at in the past, even they are starting to tick up. So coming out of the pandemic, there was a little bit maybe a focus on other things, trying to keep the business running. So now we're going to bring that back with the GDSs and work with them a little closer again to see what we can do to identify what gaps are left and how we can close those gaps. And I think in some of our preliminary findings, what we're seeing is some of it relates to the processes that are at the agency level. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. So the next slide, please, Jennifer. So up that, hold right there for a minute. So I'm going to stop here and just see if there's any questions that are out there, if there's anything.
Yes, Kevin, actually, there actually is a question about data integrity. So let me read it for you. It says, do we have data report from ARC for agent transactions related to data integrity that impacts interchange and compliance fees? Meaning, do we have something that shows by agent the impacts to interchange and compliance fees?
Ironically, we do. We've been working on some internal reporting, and we launched it about a year ago, and it really gives us some greater flexibility into what we can see. So we have the ability to look at data now by airline, by GDS, by agency. So for instance, if agency ABC is out there, and they want to see how they're performing, we can look at it by their data, by GDS. So we can look at all 4 GDSs to see if there's a difference within the GDS and how that data is being passed through, and if there's any impact to specific airlines. So I think if I was an agency, and I think there's an issue, I'd like to understand where I am, I'd say reach out to me, and we can definitely talk about how we can present that data and share it, and you can see where that impact is, and we can talk specifically about some of the items that may be impacting data that you guys could impact or change on your side to help improve that for the payment chain from start to finish. So good question. Thank you for that.
Yeah, I think the key is it's an internal report. So if someone wanted to get that data, they'd have to hook up with you to see it.
Correct. Yeah, that's nothing that's out there published at this point in time. Ideally, we'd like to maybe get to that level, but I think that's going to be a little ways off. So like I said, we just launched it earlier this year, and we continue to fine tune it. And it seems like about every month we find additional ways to improve our ability to look into that data and to look at various types of transactions and what we can do to further pinpoint where those gaps are. So good.
Okay, that's one for now. We have a couple more, but I think that we're going to talk about a couple of these coming up, so we'll address them as we go forward.
Good. So yeah, so let's talk a little bit about 3D Secure and what ARC's been doing to support that. So first of all, let's just start out with a high-level definition. I mean, 3D Secure has been out there for some time. Chip-enabled cards have been in the US since, I believe, about 2015. But 3D Secure really addresses the online transaction. And what 3D Secure is, I'm just going to go with the definition. It's an additional layer of security available to merchants to attempt to authenticate the cardholder of the transaction. So as we're going online, there's always been that challenge as to who that cardholder is, and am I actually dealing with the cardholder as the customer? And so through 3D Secure, what they're trying to do is authenticate that that cardholder is in fact associated with that card. So one of the things I like to think of is one of the ways that authentication takes place is through a text message or a one-time code to your phone. So I know, for instance, when I log into my banking application, I will get a screen pop up on my banking application and say, message has been sent to your phone. Get a message on my phone through a text. I put in that key, that 6-digit code they give me, and that authenticates me to get into the application. I also know that on my phone I get text messages from my bank when I have an online transaction. I set that up with my bank, and so anytime they see an online transaction, they send me a text message saying, hey, transaction happened at Amazon for $138. And if I don't do anything, I believe they're assuming I'm authenticating because I'm not taking any action on that transaction. So that's sort of the high level view of what 3D Secure does and what it's attempting to do with that authentication part of it. And so really where 3D Secure comes into play or is applicable in our industry is in the online channel, or when you're doing an e-commerce direct application. So you're going into a travel agency, logging into their website and handling the transaction via that application. It's not really set up for if you happen to do a call center. I don't believe anybody mails in orders anymore, or even faxes them in, so they might call. But it's usually online that this application is there for. Because of that interaction, you really can't share or don't want to share any of that authentication information with a third party, such as an agent that might be handling or helping you to handle that order. And what 3D Secure doesn't address is it doesn't address fraud chargeback. So if it's a true charge fraud back, it's not going to address that. And then it also doesn't really address service-related applications or service-related chargebacks either. So if it's a chargeback related to a flight not taking off, or something along a hotel dissatisfaction with a room, 3D Secure is not going to help that. It's really designed to help authenticate the cardholder to the card and to that transaction. So next slide, Judy. So here we're going to walk through a high-level flow of 3DS just to help level set everybody. I know in the past I've received some questions from agencies saying, "Hey, how can I enable 3DS? What does it take for me to get that service available to me?" So part of this, we thought we'd just give you a high-level overview of the process flow. So we start out with the customer. As I mentioned, this is in an online environment, so you're logging in or going to the agency's website. You're going to go ahead and, let's say I want to put in a ticket from Chicago to Paris. I'm going to pick the itinerary. I'm going to pick my flights. I'm going to go ahead and enter that information. I'm going to add my payment information, and then I'm going to hit enter. And so what that does is it takes that payment information, sends it to the, in this case, it's an OTA we have set up in the example. So that OTA is going to bundle the payment information that they have along with other data elements. Right now, 3DS has the ability to look at about 170 data elements, and I'll touch a little bit more on that in a minute. But they're going to take some of the data elements, such as maybe device ID, if you've heard that. It identifies that it came in on your tablet or your computer or even your phone. It might take your email. It might take your web location or your browser activity. So it's going to take those data elements. It's going to pass it over to a third-party authentication provider. They're going to bundle that data up. They're going to send that data off to the various issuers. So they're going to send that down to the issuer. The issuer is going to look at that data and say, yep, I have enough information based on what you're sharing that I believe that, or it is the card holder and the card associated, and they'll send that information back through to the OTA. Or they might say, nope, I'm not quite sure that the card and card holder are associated, so I'm going to go 3.5 in this case to a one-time code. It's going to send some authentication message out. It's going to ask you to authenticate that transaction, and then take that data, pass it back to the authentication provider, and they're going to pass it back to the OTA. So at a high level, that's the flow. It happens in milliseconds. A lot of data is passing, and those data elements help to authenticate the transaction. So at step 5, we're back to the OTA. They have the data passed through to them with the authentication information from the issuer. And now they're going to take that data and bundle it up and send it to the GDS. So at this point, if you don't send data onto the GDS to pass it along in the payment chain, there's little value for really what we believe is the true benefit of 3DS, which is the liability shift. So you need to make sure that that authentication data is passed along to the GDS so it can pass through the payment chain, and that liability shift for those eligible transactions will take place. So some OTAs, some agencies might want to say, well, geez, no, I'm good with that. I'm good with just getting the data to me. I'm going to use it as part of my risk evaluation tools. But if you're doing all that work, I think it's kind of odd that you want to do that extra step and pass it off to the GDS. So at that point, when the OTA passes the data off to the GDS, they're going to bundle that authentication data up along with data that they're going to send out for authorization. So pre-3DS, that was happening today. That's the process with the GDS. But now they're adding in the authentication information as part of the authorization request process, going out to the card brand, who then goes out to the issuer. And so now the issuer, and I'm following past 7, the issuer will now have the authentication data in the authorization request as well. So they can sort of say, okay, yep, this is what I sent out. It's the authorization request, the data looks good. So that gets passed back to the GDS. So now we're sitting at the GDS, and what the GDS is going to do is they now take the authorization data that they received back, along with some of the authentication data that we have identified in our spec, and we call it the SPRF, the System Provider Reporting File, that the GDSs take and send authorization and the authentication data to ARC. So now we have that data sitting in our warehouse. We're going to take that data and we're going to bundle it up, and we create a file that we send to the airline acquirers, and we call that a credit card billing file. So that file goes out to the airline acquirers, and as we're looking at that line 9, we also send to Amex and Discover. So we go direct out to, I believe, probably about 25 plus acquirers around the world, as well as send a file directly to Amex and Discover, and I'll come back to them in just a minute. So from a MasterCard and Visa perspective, the acquirer then takes that file, they send it out along path 10 into the MasterCard and Visa networks. And then, of course, those networks then take the data and send it out to the various issuers. So at that point, you now have the authentication data that was passed from all the way from the customer out on the front end to the GDS to ARC to the brands and then directly to the issuer. So the issuer can see on the settlement file that that transaction has the authentication data as well. So we have a full loop of the data being passed for authentication, and that transaction should qualify for the liability shift if a chargeback would be put through. Ideally, as an airline or as a merchant, if you have your own merchant account as an agent, you would never see those chargebacks because the network would identify that transaction as being authenticated, and they would stop that chargeback right at that point and push it back to the issuer. So once the data is all at the card issuer, they of course then go ahead and fund back to the card brands, go along 12 and 13 back to the airline and acquirers, and then the acquirers, and also at this point in time, Amex and Discover, since we sent the file directly to them, they would fund back the dollars to the airlines. From a high level perspective, that's the flow. Again, there's a couple of key things to remember. The heavy lift is on the OTA side. They're going to have to, create that partnership with third-party authentication providers, and they're going to have to work with their GDS on how the application, the API works to pass that data back and forth. The high-level flows. So, any questions out there?
I don't. We do. There are some 3D Secure questions, but I think you're going to maybe cover them in your next slide.
So let's see why.
So can you go to the next slide, Judy?
Let's go to the next slide then. So yeah, that's the update. So so from an update perspective, so 3DS is really out there, and like anything else, is progressing with different versions. So they start out with version 1. That was probably around 2016, 2017. It only had about 15 data elements that they were passing. And so as things progress, I think they're now up to version 2.3, I think was released out in September. And that version has, as I mentioned, over 170 data elements. So if you're working with the GDS, you're definitely going to be working in 2.0 requirements. But Visa and MasterCard and Amex have identified that 1.0 is going to retire in October. So that's just more of an FYI as an agency, if you're out there thinking about how you're working with the GDSs, you definitely want to make sure you're working in 2.0 or higher when you're looking at the versions and the data requirements. So currently, ARC is set up as I went through the flow. We have our data is updated on the SPERF. We have the credit card billing file updated to support EMV 3DS. So 2.0 is the term or called EMV 3DS. So if you hear 2.0 or that EMV 3DS, those two are interchangeable. So we have our data set up on the clearing and the settlement file to pass through. And then from a MasterCard and Visa perspective, we have their brands or their version of 3DS identified here. Identity check verified by Visa. And safe key. So we are all set up to support those in the channel. And Discover is still TBD. So we're out there and we're ready to support 3DS when the agencies are ready to go. So
Kevin, there's a few questions around liability shift.
Okay.
So when you say 1.0 is retired, what does that mean for liability shift versus 2.0?
Yeah, so from a liability standpoint, when they retire 1.0, I believe they're still going to support, and I will have to double check. I don't think they're going to support the liability shift in 1.0 as of the October date. So
yeah, I can concur. I concur that that's true. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. So, and again, to let you know, we're not aware of anybody today in the agency channel. Now, airlines that are out there, you guys may be supporting 3D Secure in your direct channel, but currently there is nobody supporting or nobody carrying out 3D Secure in the agency channel today. So again, if you're starting out, you're going to start out with 2.0 or 2.2 or 2.3, depending on where you want to go. I would think you'd go with the higher version. And so really, the fact that the retirement is taking place and the liability shift shouldn't be an issue for anybody starting out with 2.0. If you're on an older version, you definitely want to look at what that means to change over to 2.0 so you can continue to get that liability shift.
Yeah, so just to reiterate, effective in October, a merchant has to be, or in the agency channel, the airline, the agency needs to be supporting EMV 3DS or 2.0 or higher to get the liability shift from fraud chargebacks.
Correct.
And my understanding, and we've got a question here about Visa's fraud program and their liability shift. My understanding is that EMV 3DS liability shift applies to all three card brands.
Yes, and it would apply to Discover as well once they get to that point and provide, their solution for Protect By in the agency channel.
Right. And so there's a question about whether or not 3D Secure is only available via OTAs, or can it be integrated into a GDS ticket sale? Do you want to take that one, or do you want?
Yeah, I can take it, Jennifer, and then
okay.
I know that there are some GDSs out there that are looking at supporting those type of products for some of the smaller ones. It really goes back to contacting the GDS and working with them as to how they end up supporting or how they will support it. So like I said, it is a third-party relationship that the agency will have, but I know some of the GDSs are looking at what I guess I would call a white label product where they could help maybe a mid-size or a mom and pop take advantage of this offering.
Yeah, and so I guess that might be applicable to a situation where, okay, so maybe you've got someone on the phone and you want to validate them. You would send them a link that they could then click into the link and authenticate themselves into the GDS. I mean, I know that there's some agencies that are looking at that where the customer still has to go online into a link, but there is an opportunity to authenticate the customer even though they originally came to you on the phone. But those are things that will have to be built or developed by the GDSs.
Correct.
I would think ARC doesn't have a product like that.
Correct.
Let's see here. So can you give us a little bit more update on 3D Secure for Discover and Diners Club?
Yes, we've been working with them, and it's really in their ball court to figure out a solution for how they're going to have 3DS work in the agency channel. We've been having conversations with them. They really, at this point, don't have a solution, at least through Discover. And so we're really waiting for them. We meet with the brands on a bi-monthly basis, basically, and I know we're working with Discover currently on a number of data integrity updates. And so I think it's, like I said, it's more TBD right now as to when Discover is going to be in a position to provide a solution for the agency channel. If you're interested, and you have a Discover rep, or if you want to send me an email saying that you're interested in it, let me know, and I can definitely share that. I think with some of the things we do, definitely consumer or end user, feedback definitely helps give them a better understanding of the priority they need to put in or on a product within their business as well. So we can tell them certain things until I think we're blue in the face, but if they actually start to hear from airlines and customers that, hey, Discover, we want your Protect By service in the agency channel, that will definitely help them to prioritize it higher.
So here's another question about 3D Secure. It asks if we have card denial data. I think maybe they mean like where cards are declined due to lack of 3D Secure. And then it appears 3D Secure is more widely accepted in Europe than the US, and many US merchants are still not using 3DS. Do you want to respond to that?
Sure. So from a US perspective, and you're right, over in Europe, they have some banking regulations that required the European market to implement 3D Secure. And so Europe is much further advanced. They've had chip cards for a lot longer as well. So just from a payment security perspective, they're ahead of the US. here in the US, we're starting to make inroads as like we have the data set up. We are all set to go. So I think right now it's, really to the agencies as far as the interest. The infrastructure is there other than for Discover. And so if this is something you want to look at, definitely raise your hand and start talking to your GDS about the opportunities to implement. As far as I know, other than Discover, there are really no roadblocks to implementing 3DS here in the US. It just all depends on the level of effort that the agency needs to work on with the GDS. And of course, you have to look at the cost benefit analysis. If you don't have a lot of chargebacks, then 3DS might not be a good solution for the cost that it's going to incur to implement. If you're high chargebacks, it definitely may be worth looking at as to what 3DS could do to help reduce the level of chargebacks you're seeing, and that cost benefit may be there. Okay, yeah.
Kevin,
Sorry.
can you hear?
There, now I can.
Okay,
I'm sorry.
sorry.
Okay.
Sorry. So there's a question about engagement with OTAs. The OTAs have not widely integrated 3D Secure. They're not widely using it. They have pretty sophisticated fraud prevention tools in place today. So they are not doing it. And actually, at the payments forum, pretty big discussion about 3D Secure, and most of the airlines, even for direct sales, haven't implemented it just because they don't like the friction that it causes at the point of sale. They think it causes a loss in sales because of shopping cart abandonment, and so a lot of the major airlines haven't done it either.
Yeah, unfortunately, 2.0 is hopefully trying to, with the additional data, they're trying to reduce that friction. So if they can get more data to get passed through, hopefully that will reduce that friction. You're not going to see that cart abandonment take place. But to your point, Jennifer, the airlines haven't noticed that benefit as of yet.
Okay, I think we probably need to move on. We've only got 12 minutes left. Can you go to the next slide, Judy? Chargeback to disputes. I'll go through this pretty quickly because I think the questions are really the most important part. So here's some trends in debit memos. You can see there's a little expansion of some of these fields and reduction in others when it comes to just debit memos in general over the last 5 years. Chargebacks still pretty steady. In 2020, they were higher than some of the others and as a percentage, higher than previous years as a percentage, which isn't really surprising given what 2020 brought. Commissions were big in 2020 and 21 as well. Booking violations were big in 2021. This just kind of shows sort of the trend in debit memos overall. Let's move on to the next slide where we can talk specifically about chargebacks, what we're seeing in memo data. What this really shows is sort of what I find frustrating, that a lot of the chargeback reasons are other or chargeback. So the yellow just says chargeback, the green is other. And so we've got some airlines out there that are not providing the reason for the chargeback. So all they're saying is it's a chargeback and not giving us any reason for it. Let's go on to the next slide. Here's the ratio year over year. So you see in 2020, ratios are funny because if the sales are down, chargebacks are going to be up as a ratio. Clearly, chargebacks were up in 2020, but the ratio is down again in 2022. Of course, it's going to be down because our volumes are up over what they were in 2020, and chargebacks, kind of come in months after the original transaction. But overall, even in 2020 at 20 basis points, chargebacks are pretty low in our industry compared to really any other industry. To say that we have, for example, in 2020, 7 basis points of chargebacks is pretty remarkable. It's an extremely low ratio to sales. Next slide. And so you see in 2022, halfway through the year, we're a little above where we were in 2021. I expect by the end of this year, we'll be over the 24 million that we were in 2021. It's still a lot of chargebacks. It's a lot of money out there. Anything we can do to get this number down is what we want to be working on. Let's go to the next slide. So out of the payments form, what we have discovered is that we're seeing a growing number of these technical chargebacks. And so I'm calling them technical chargebacks because they don't fall into a fraud category. They don't fall into a services not rendered type category. These are just chargebacks because the transaction got to the issuer and the issuer couldn't see where a valid authorization was obtained. And so that gives them an opportunity to initiate a chargeback on that transaction, which ends up coming back to the airline and ultimately to the agency. And so those technical chargebacks are sort of the reason why we are turning our focus to really trying to reinforce with agents the need to get a valid authorization through your GDS at the time of ticketing. If that isn't happening, then that auth response data that comes with the transaction along with the approval code isn't going to be passed through that transaction flow and ultimately to the card issuer, which then leaves the transaction open for a technical chargeback. And so if you as an agency don't take anything away from this webinar today, just know it's really important to get an authorization on every transaction at the time of ticketing. The other thing that came out is concerns around what's going to happen now that vouchers are expiring. Back to the previous slide. And the reality is all the card brands announced, and they're pretty well aligned, that the maximum amount a chargeback can come in is 540 days from the transaction date. That may seem like a long time, and it is a long time, unless you think about a transaction where the flight is next year at this time. So it's, 350 days from now, say, and then they have 200 days from them to initiate a dispute. The flight date is kind of key when it comes to disputes because it's when things can go wrong. So 540 days, while it seems like a long way out, at least it is a concrete date that's saying, that voucher may be good for 3 years. That doesn't mean that that customer then has 3 more years to initiate a dispute when they are unable to use that voucher. We also, the payments form kind of reinforced what we already knew, which is that a big pain point in the chargeback process is working between agents and airlines, really from airlines to agents, where, are the airlines giving the agency an opportunity to respond, manage their customer? Are they getting the data to the agency quickly? And for agents, that's the biggest pain point. And most of the airlines that are in that room are doing a pretty good job at it. But there's always an opportunity to sort of do it better and faster. And so that's something that ARC wants to focus on for the rest of this year. Let's go to the next slide. I'm gonna try to rush through these because we're running out of time. Next slide, Judy. We've kind of talked about these. One of our focuses, in addition to improving data, is supporting multiple forms of payment, expediting exchanges. This is what we want to work on this year at ARC. Next slide. We have enabled Uplift within our system, which is a buy now, pay later offering, focused specifically on travel. We do not currently have any airlines that have enabled it, but ARC has it enabled so that when an airline is able to offer it, we're able to support it. Let's go to the next slide. NDC, I think I'm going to skip this. This is just an overview of sort of the transactions that ARC that are NDC versus Direct Connect. It's not, I think people who are not in payments don't have a great view into what's happening in the NDC world. You can see from this, we don't have a lot of transactions coming through on NDC, but it is growing. Next slide, Judy. And this is a Direct Connect, same kind of thing, where the pink is the general ARC volume and the, the pink is FairLogic specifically, and the blue is a Direct Connect directly to ARC from an airline. Next slide. Let's go to the next one because it kind of summarizes where we are right now. So these are, I just kind of highlighted what the key sort of payment topics are right now. Buy now, pay later, mobile, tokenization and how we enable tokenization, trying to reduce exposure of credit cards out there, RTP, real-time payments, contactless, open banking. These are, you know, direct consumer to business payments, cryptocurrency. I think we've been talking about it for a long time. Over 10 years, we've been talking about how to enable cryptocurrency. And there hasn't really been a focus because no one really cared about it, but I think that's going to change. And of course, customer experience. Next slide. So let's just go on to the questions. So there's one here about it says Jennifer mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that there's an effort to have authorization codes become more mandatory at time of ticketing. Concern is that if the ticket transaction has gone through, the ticket is issued and the chargeback comes through the system, the airline sits on the bill. Why can't there be more measures, pressures placed on the credit card companies to ensure the approval is made? I'm not exactly sure what this person is saying. Getting an approval code doesn't guarantee that that consumer on the other side of that transaction is who they say they are. So there's always an opportunity for a chargeback to come back for fraud. I think maybe that's where this question is coming from, is just obtaining an approval code doesn't guarantee that that customer is who they say they are and doesn't protect against the chargeback. There's also a question about, in the old days, travel agents were protected by making the impression of a credit card and having the passenger sign the credit card charge form. How do agents protect themselves? And the reality is, at this point, that guidance or that rule was based on the credit card company's rules. And over the last couple of years, the credit card company's rules have changed. And the only way to 100% protect yourself against a fraud chargeback is to do 3D Secure. That's, the card brands have come out and said that's using your phone to send someone a text is the best way to validate the identity of that consumer and that card holder. And so that's why 3D Secure has been said as really the only way to protect yourselves against fraud chargebacks. What else? Do you see any other questions out here, Kevin, we need to answer?
In a minute, one question, the customer approvals the charge initially, then denies the charge to the credit card, airline charge agent, sorry, let me start over. Customer approves the charge initially, then denies charge to credit card. The charge the airline to the agency, only the agency recourse is then taken back. That one.
Take them to court, yeah. So this is, I mean, if you have a customer that that initiates a chargeback, and you know who they are, and they were a good customer of yours, they're basically perpetrating fraud on you. They are, it's friendly fraud. We call it friendly fraud. It's not, obviously not friendly. I call it chargeback fraud, where bad guys are using the chargeback process to initiate disputes and basically stealing from merchants. The only recourse really is to take them to court if you know who they are. One question, is DocuSign a valid authorization for the transaction? No, it is not. It doesn't, the card brands don't recognize that as a fraud prevention tool for validating the identity of a cardholder. So there's no, imprints, there's a question about imprints. Imprints aren't a valid protection against a dispute anyway, or a chargeback. So, you know, there's no need to obtain an imprint. I think that's, I mean, yeah, Uplift. Is there an agency commission for Uplift? No, not if the airline is a merchant of record on the transaction. If you have a relationship directly with Uplift, they may provide you with a commission. Are we going to have this available afterward?
The questions, all the questions, Jennifer?
No, I mean, do we have a recording of this?
Yes, the recording of this session will be posted on our artcorp.com website under on-demand webinars in that section. Give it just a couple of days so that our web team can put that up there, but this will be posted. Also, all of the questions that were asked and written in today will be captured, and I will provide that report to Jennifer, you, and Kevin. So that if you wanted to take a look through those, reach out to anyone, or have additional Q&As posted on our website, we can do that. So you'll get all the questions, and you'll have the individuals that ask them. Also, up on the screen here, you can send an email directly to Jennifer or Kevin. I encourage you to do so if there are these burning questions that you didn't get a chance to get asked or answered during this session. They are our experts. You can always certainly reach out to me if you can't remember their email addresses, jhoward@artcorp.com. Happy to help. So I just want to give a big thank you for everyone that attended today. Really, really thank you for your time. We know that's valuable. And also a big thank you to you, Jennifer and Kevin, for taking the time to spend here with myself and our customers this afternoon. So thank you very much. Awesome information that's provided as always. I just wanted, Jennifer had touched a little bit on, I just wanted to remind everyone, we do have our Fraud Awareness Month coming up, the month of September. We kick it off with our Cornelius Hadding and Doug Nass from ARC on September 7th. And then we have sprinkled throughout the whole month of September, we have various guest presenters that will be bringing new, interesting aspects of what's happening in the world of fraud and trends, and kind of doing also what's been happening since the pandemic. So all kinds of good stuff coming up that month. We have another webinar with IATA next week, and ARC, and kind of some training opportunities. So anyway, so thank you everyone. Again, thank you Jennifer and Kevin, really appreciate it. And thanks everyone for hanging on with us. We're a few minutes late. Thanks.
Thank you.